In December of 2019, I made a video about controversial documentaries that were banned. The title is pretty self-explanatory, and it sent me down a rabbit hole of disturbing pieces of media that ran into some pretty intense censorship. However, there was one documentary in that video that I think I did a disservice. A movie that certainly ruffled some feathers and left me with some burning questions. Today I'm going to answer those questions and do a proper deep dive into the documentary known as Titicut Follies, a documentary created in 1967 by Frederick Wiseman that explores Bridgewater State Hospital, a state-run facility for the criminally insane. The movie shows us an incredibly close-up and personal look at the mental, physical, and emotional abuse that took place in this hospital. It is arguably one of the most censored, full-featured documentaries ever created, with the state actually stepping in and stopping it from being released. Fortunately, the full thing is out there and I've managed to find a copy of it. Today we're going to be talking about why this movie was made, the contents of the documentary, and why it was so censored to the point that it almost didn't exist at all. Frederick Wiseman was born on the 1st of January 1930, and the first 30 years of his life weren't actually centered that much around filmmaking. He did get a Bachelor of Arts in 1951, which may have sparked some interest in the subject, but he strayed away from this when he got a law degree from Yale in 1954 and served time in the military during the Korean War. It didn't seem like his path was headed for a lifetime of filmmaking, but all of that changed when he decided to produce the feature film known as The Cool World in 1963. The movie was shot in a semi-documentary style, and although Wiseman was merely the producer and didn't have a lot of creative input into this project, he was clearly inspired by the process because less than 2 years after the release of this movie, he began working on a documentary of his own, and this was of course Titicut Follies. It's amazing that this is the first full-feature documentary that Wiseman directed, considering the cultural impact that it had, but it's important to quickly look at the other projects he created after this to get a sense of the kinds of documentaries he created and how that ties into the project we're going to be discussing. We don't have to do a deep dive to achieve this. In fact, you can actually just have a look at some of the titles of his works. These include names like High School, Law and Order, Hospital, Welfare, Blind, Deaf, and even Ballet. These are very direct names that show us a very direct style of filmmaking, and after watching a handful of these movies, I can tell you that there aren't that many surprises. They do exactly what they say on the tin, and that's essentially Wiseman's style. He takes a look at various different institutions such as healthcare, education, or mental health by visiting these places for 4 to 6 weeks and filming them for hours on end. He rarely strays away from this style, and something he never does is intervene. That means no narrations, no motion graphics, and no title cards. This creates a unique and very to-the-point style that Wiseman has mastered, and we see all of this in the movie we are going to be discussing. Because with all of this in mind, it's really not surprising that Frederick took an interest in Bridgewater State Hospital. This place has a long history and an incredibly troubled past. It was established in 1855, and in all that time, nobody had properly documented what was actually happening behind its doors. A year before he began shooting, Wiseman phoned the superintendent of the hospital. They both came up with some terms and conditions in regards to how Frederick would go about shooting the documentary, but in general, he was given permission to make his piece. This later became a major point of contention that we'll get into after we discuss the movie, but all you need to know for now is that it was full steam ahead, and Frederick began gathering equipment, acquiring film, and teaming up with an acclaimed anthropologist and filmmaker known as John Marshall, who would be there on location to film and record everything while Frederick directed the documentary. In the spring of 1966, the duo entered the premises for the first time, and for the next 29 days, they shot 80,000 feet of film, analyzed every nook and cranny of the building, and after editing it for a year, Frederick Wiseman came back with the following 84-minute documentary. It goes as follows. In the beginning, we see a group of men giving a performance on a stage. We can quickly tell that this is not a professional performance, as many of the men look uncomfortable or awkward, like they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. This is because these are the patients of the hospital performing at a talent show that is called Titicut Follies. This is interesting to note because, like I said, after this, Wiseman would name his projects in a very direct fashion, but this is a title that requires context and possibly contains a layer of irony. naming it after the hospital's talent show, which is a relatively light part of the documentary, when the movie actually shows us the worst side of the hospital. But I digress. After the men give their performance, a man in a suit, who is most likely the superintendent, stands on stage and tells the patients a joke. It's a relatively jovial introduction, to be honest. The crowd are laughing and clapping, and although there are some awkward moments, the energy doesn't appear to be that bad or sour. But of course, we know that this won't last long. We cut to a harrowing scene. An array of different patients are going through what looks like an admission process for the hospital. It is not well organized. Many patients are just sort of aimlessly sprawled around, their clothes are taken, and they are given identical uniforms to wear. It is a dehumanizing system that leaves many of the patients waiting their turn while they stand there completely naked in a cold, hollow hall. What happens next appears to be a sort of interview with the patient who has done some pretty horrendous things. He admits this to a doctor who is, I suppose, analyzing him, although that is a bit of a stretch. He's smoking, not making a lot of eye contact, interrupting the patient quite a bit, and asking questions that seem inappropriate. It doesn't seem like they are making much progress, and if this is one of the main doctors in the facility, we can tell that the patients are in trouble.
Oh, are you tired about your wife? Are you interested in other women?
I'm interested in other women, and I don't know, it's how I can't.
Have you ever get concerned about to have a matured woman? It's a big, tall, or husky, luscious-looking female. What you are interested in, big breast or small breast?
It cuts in between the interview and the admission process, and then we see a patient being sent into a cell. His hair has been shaved off, he is stripped of his clothes, and the guard accompanying him is also smoking. At one point we overhear the words, "Is there an empty one?" insinuating that he's not even being brought to a cell that is his own, but instead a completely random one. This is a simple clip, but it is very effective. The patient has no clothes, he has been stripped of a lot of his character, and is now alone and naked in an empty cell looking out at a barbed window, surrounded by guards who mistreat him. There are parts of this documentary that are significantly more disturbing in a literal sense, but this is one of the most poignant moments of the documentary, and it's a real sign of things to come. The next 5 or so minutes of the documentary are fairly tame. We see shots of the courtyard, which is a depressing sight with very little going on. We then see a clip of a man singing a song in front of a TV, which is one of the few moments in this movie that's actually quite nice. He seems to know all of the words and is quite content singing and sometimes listening to the tune. Unfortunately, the niceties don't last long because after this, the guards begin to take the patients out of their cell to clean them. This is ironically quite a messy process. The patients are again completely naked, taken out of their cells, and occasionally put on the ground, while they wait for their cells to be cleaned. They are also spoken to in a disrespectful fashion. We especially see this with a patient named Jim, who is actually taken across the floor to be shaven. On the way there, he is slapped, repeatedly asked questions he does not know the answer to, and made fun of. He is then shaved in a hasty manner and brought back to his empty cell that doesn't even contain a bed. He is clearly in need of therapeutic and mental help, but is literally given the opposite of this, with one guard in particular antagonizing him on a constant basis.
I spick and span, very clean.
What? Real clean, Jim?
Yes, sir!
Huh? What are you doing, Jim? Good morning, Jim.
Morning.
How's that room gonna be morning?
Very best of mornings.
Huh? What? What'd you say?
I said I'm very clean!
Louder, Jim.
Tonight!
What?
Tonight!
What'd you say? Can't hear you, Jim.
What are you hiding, Jim?
After this, it cuts to some general conversation from the guards, and then we once again see the superintendent, who is performing on stage for a second time, singing a song with somebody else who could be an inmate or could be a guard. It's difficult to tell, and I can't find much about this scene online, but it's pretty eerie to see the superintendent having so much fun on stage. Considering how much emotional and mental abuse we just witnessed, the dynamic and energy from the beginning has completely shifted, and we are in a totally different world. Around 35 minutes in, we see a patient arguing with the same doctor from earlier. He seems eager to explain to the doctor that he is fine and doesn't need the same medication or treatment that the other patients need. The doctor doesn't really seem to be listening, despite the fact that the man is saying the medication is making him worse and ruining him.
But I never been in mental institution.
That's
Nobody
right.
thought I should be.
I am using your words. You looked at me and you tell me I'm a schizophrenic paranoia. Right? How do you know? Because I speak well. Because I stand up for what I think.
Because you got the psychological testings. You got.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
Such as test which asked me how many times do I go to the toilet? Do I believe in God? I mean, well, how ridiculous can you get?
This is a good example of the patients being ignored even when they seem to be fine. This man made several good points in this clip that weren't even remotely considered by the doctor, and he was even told if he did end up going back to an actual prison, he would just be transferred back almost immediately. After this, we see a man ranting to the camera about war, politics, and communism. Again, he's quite coherent and articulate and actually attracts a decent crowd of people. He ends up debating another patient in the courtyard for several minutes. Around 45 minutes into the documentary, we see the same doctor we've been seeing all throughout the movie checking on a patient. He opens up the small flap in their door and callously asks them how they are and if they've eaten. After the patient says no, the doctor decides to call somebody and asks them to bring the tube. By the sounds of things, this seems like a fairly casual process, but it is anything but that. It'll be hard to show you this next sequence, but I will do my best to describe it and I'll show you what I can. The emaciated patient is brought to a nearby table. He hasn't eaten in 3 days and his figure is thin and frail. He is restrained on a table and a long tube is put inside of his nose. The doctor, who is also smoking while doing this, puts some food into the tube that drips into the patient's nose and eventually down his throat. The documentary cuts between this patient being force-fed and footage that shows us something even more disturbing. A man is cleaning and preparing a corpse for a funeral. At first, we cannot tell who this is, but we quickly realize that it's the same man who is being force-fed. The process of the corpse being prepared is ironically much calmer and more peaceful, something Wiseman actually commented on after the fact when he said he was treated better in death than he was in life. Later on, Wiseman actually said that he regretted cutting these two things together in this fashion, that it was unnecessary, but I think this quote is the exact reason why it was so effective, because it's a very true and scary sentiment. Evidently, force-feeding this man did not work. Maybe they could have tried a different method or actually tried to give him the help he needed, but that was never really on the table. He was doomed from the start, and like Wiseman said, death was the only thing that made them treat him with some decency. After this disturbing sequence of events, we cut to something that is a bit jarring, a birthday party. We see a patient blowing out candles, nurses serving cake, and the superintendent singing again. At this stage, his singing almost looks sociopathic. Now that we have the full context to how dark and disturbing Bridgewater truly is, him being jovial and happy does not give us the light-hearted energy it did in the beginning. His personality looks stranger and stranger as the layers of the hospital are peeled off. Following this scene, we see the patient from earlier who was arguing with the doctor, and he is once again pleading his case. During the conversation, we find out his name is Vladimir, and that he was only supposed to be at this hospital for observation, but they decided to keep him there. Again, the doctors dismiss this. Eventually, they cut him off while he is talking, and take him back to his cell.
Well, Vladimir, as I promised you before, if I see enough improvement in you,
But how can I improve if I'm getting worse? I'm trying to tell you, day by day I am getting worse because of the circumstances, because of the situation. Now you tell me until you see an improvement. Each time I get worse. So obviously it's the treatment that I'm getting, or the situation, or the place, or the patients, or the inmates.
thank you, Vladimir.
No, I'm it's like this.
Well, I think what we have to do with him is put him on a higher dose of tranquilizers and see if we can bring the paranoid elements under a little better control and see if we can get him back on medication, if he's taking it now, and I'm not even sure he is.
As you can see, they actually correlate his complaints and frustrations to paranoia, and because of this, they increase his tranquilizer medication to try and calm him down. Now, there could be other things going on in the background that somewhat justifies this, but based on the two conversations we have seen, this does not appear to be a wise decision, and could be an example of misdiagnosing and over-medicating the patients, which definitely happened in some capacity and could easily be the case here as well. Around 1 hour 10 minutes into the documentary, we see a myriad of different clips. First, we see a patient taking a bath who then returns to his cell and starts screaming. We then see an array of patients that looks like it could be some kind of common area. The patients are sprawled around and they aren't really doing anything, but in that same area, we see a priest performing some kind of religious ceremony on a patient. It could be a confession or maybe some kind of therapy, but it also could be a patient who is on their deathbed receiving their last rites. It's difficult to tell, but there is something about it that's a bit eerie and uncomfortable, which leaves me to believe that it may be the latter. After this, we enter the final two sequences, which are quite profound. We see a body being taken out of a morgue and put into a coffin. The coffin is then put into a car and brought to a graveyard that is likely near the area. A sort of makeshift funeral occurs with several employees from the hospital. It is a hasty process that ends abruptly, leaving one final shot of the coffin alone in the graveyard. We then see the final sequence, which is once again a shot from the talent show. At the beginning I commented that this almost seems like a jovial occurrence, but by now it just seems like a minor distraction from a very harsh reality. Maybe that's all Titicut Follies is, an example of how they want the public to think the hospital is like, when in reality, most of the patients will be leaving like this. The only person who truly looks like they're having fun is the superintendent, who at this stage looks like an Orwellian dictator as opposed to somebody who is truly there to help the patients. Finally, the movie cuts to the credits, and with no music in the background, we leave the documentary in complete silence. When I started watching this movie, I had a different perception of it. I actually thought it would be harder to watch with there being more examples of the physical abuse and the mental torment the patients had to face. But actually, it was hard to watch for a completely different reason, because this documentary shows us a so-called hospital that truly does not care for its patients, and it shows us this in a more nuanced way, with patients being ignored, dehumanized, and cared about far more after they pass away than when they were alive. The scary thing is that the superintendent, the employees, and the rest of the staff all knew that Wiseman and John Marshall would be filming there for a month, which leads me to believe that they were probably told to be on their best behavior. A disturbing thought to say the least. I can only imagine how the patients would be treated when the cameras weren't rolling. Wiseman took the 80,000 feet of film he had recorded. By my calculations, he most likely had around 40 hours of footage to condense into an 80-minute documentary, so the process was going to take a while, around a year to be exact. The project was slated for a 1967 release, but after Wiseman edited it, he started to run into a lot of problems. It was originally shown at the New York Film Festival, but just before this happened, the Massachusetts government attempted to have it censored, claiming that it violated the rights of the inmates' privacy and dignity. Wiseman had gotten all the necessary permissions to release this project, and as I mentioned earlier, he studied law in one of the most prestigious colleges in the country, so he had a good understanding of what he was legally allowed to do. Still, this didn't deter the state from trying their hardest to stop any and all productions of this documentary. They may have failed to stop the movie being seen at the New York Film Festival, but in 1968 they took Wiseman to trial, and after 18 days, a Superior Court judge known as Harry Callis stated that the movie had to be recalled, and he wanted to have every copy of the movie completely destroyed. He called it a nightmare of ghoulish obscenities, and seemingly saw no value in the project being released. Wiseman contested this, and he appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, who allowed the movie to be seen for educational purposes, meaning doctors, healthcare professionals, and students were occasionally allowed to see the movie. Obviously, this was still an extreme case of censorship, but this stopped the movie from being destroyed in its entirety. Sadly, it's pretty obvious that if Wiseman didn't understand the law to the extent that he did, this documentary probably would have been wiped from history completely. For over 20 years, this is how it remained. The movie was barely seen by anybody, and it became an example of the state's power and how prevalent censorship truly was. Wiseman tried to appeal this censorship to the United States Supreme Court, but they refused to even hear the case. It was a lost cause that seemingly couldn't be salvaged. There is a harsh reality behind this censorship, which is the fact that this documentary truly could have changed things, because Bridgewater State Hospital only got worse after 1967. In that same year, Albert DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler by his own confession, was admitted into the hospital but quickly managed to escape with 2 other inmates, stating that he did this because the conditions were so bad that he wanted to escape to highlight what was going on in the hospital. He turned himself in 3 days later and was sent sent to a maximum security prison. You would think that this would potentially change things when you have supposedly one of the most notorious serial killers in American history embarking on a campaign for the hospital to reform. But if anything, this made things worse. The hospital tightened up its securities, it treated the patients with considerably more suspicion, and for the next 20 years, the hospital had a stretch of abuse that is quite difficult to quantify because many things happened in secret behind closed doors. Still, here is a rough timeline of what happened in those years. 1968. A year after the documentary was supposed to be fully released, an investigation was launched into the forgotten prisoners. This means the men who were in the facility for a significantly longer period than their original sentences. It turns out that this was a recurring trend, and many of the men in the hospital should have been set free a long time ago. It's probable that some of the people in the documentary were not even supposed to be there in the first place. They investigated over 250 cases of this, and as it turns out, dozens of prisoners should have been free men years before this investigation. There was one incident of a man named Charles who was sent there in 1910 for breaking and entering. As it turns out, he was still in the hospital 50 years after he was supposed to be set free. His whole life was confined to those walls because nobody cared enough about him to check on his sentence. Of course, with many of these patients, they did not have the mental capacity to understand or combat this injustice themselves, and they were never given the proper legal counsel to fight back against it either. 1972. John Boone, the Commissioner of Corrections for the state, orders a part of the hospital to be shut down so that repairs can be made on the building. Inside, they found cell blocks that were almost 100 years old and had hardly been cleaned. They also did not have any toilets. The brick walls had no padding. The sewage system hardly worked and produced dirty water, and many of the patients had no beds to sleep on. Of course, we already know all of this information because we've seen these cells and this building in the documentary we just watched. It was all recorded 6 years prior, but because the public never got to see it, there was no outcry and nothing happened for years. This was just one small section of the building, and the rest of the building remained in a poor condition for years after this. 1975. The Harvard Crimson reports on the hospital and talks about the fact that many of these so-called doctors don't actually have any medical experience at all, which is why many of them prescribe a host of medications that only make the patients worse. One prisoner is quoted as saying, "A lot of sharp guys come in here, take drugs and get mindless. These are guys who could do things. Some of them never leave." 1978. A patient named Nathaniel Bar Jonah is admitted to the hospital for attempted murder. Less than 15 years later, he was released after the courts deemed that he was not a threat to society. Jonah admitted to having violent fantasies to multiple physicians in Bridgewater, but none of this was disclosed to the courts. After he was released, he assaulted, essayed, and possibly killed multiple children. 1981. A book titled Screw, A Guard's View of Bridgewater State Hospital is released by Tom Ryan. As the title suggests, it's a book written by a former guard who worked in the hospital for 18 months. He details gruesome abuse that includes guards pitting other patients against each other in the yard for their own amusement. This account is significantly more direct than the documentary because the guards were not playing nice for the cameras. They did not think anybody would write about their actions in a book, and for this reason, we see how abusive they truly were. 1987. The New York Times creates an expose on the hospital after 8 patients died in the space of a year. Some of these deaths were under suspicious circumstances. A lawyer named Stephen Schwartz, representing one of the families who were taking legal action against the hospital, actually spoke about the movie directly. First, he talked about the patient he was representing and said that he was restrained for 2.5 months and given 6 psychiatric drugs at vastly unsafe levels, and that he choked to death because he could not swallow his food. Then he said, "There is a direct connection between the decision not to show that film publicly and my client dying 20 years later, and a whole host of other people dying in between. In the years since Mr. Wiseman made Titicut Follies, most of the nation's big mental institutions have been closed or cut back by court orders. The film may have also influenced the closing of the institution featured." But of course, it didn't, because it was never given the chance to. This is pretty much the final nail in the coffin that solidifies the fact that this movie really could have changed things, but censorship destroyed any opportunity it had to do so. It is depressing to look back at that timeline and realize how many of those exact same things were recorded on camera. A Superior Court judge known as Andrew Meyer finally allowed the project to have a full release in 1991, 2.5 decades after it had been recorded. Even then, it had to include a note that stated that the hospital had made improvements since the recording of the documentary. A small addition, I suppose, but it must have felt like a slap in the face to have to abide by one final instruction from the state. The same state that censored this documentary for so long. Even so, it was too little too late. The movie may have been accessible to the public, but for 2.5 decades, it existed only in the shadows, much like the crimes and horrible acts that were committed in that hospital. I think it's fair to say that most of the people featured in the documentary have passed away at this stage, and that many of them probably died in that hospital. Somebody who actually is still with us is Frederick Wiseman himself, who is 93 years of age and still going. He even directed and released a movie in 2022 called A Couple. It's amazing to think that Titicut Follies was the beginning of such a long and illustrious career that was filled with amazing projects, and yet it all started with something that was anything but celebrated. A documentary that was silenced beyond belief. It was arguably his magnum opus, but it was left in the shadows. If the state listened to the story he was trying to tell us, things could have been a whole lot different. But instead, it stayed silence, and that silence was a crime bigger than anything we have discussed.